On the night of the 31st of January, 1953, death came riding on the wind. Across the North Sea basin, families tucked their children into bed, fishermen battened down their boats, and ferry passengers settled in for what should have been routine crossings. They had no idea that nature was assembling the perfect storm, a confluence of meteorological forces that would create one of the deadliest natural disasters in modern European history. Many people went to bed that fateful night, not knowing of the devastation to come, and for many, that they would not wake up in the morning. The wind outside bedroom windows was already howling with unusual ferocity, but few could have imagined that by dawn, entire communities would simply vanish beneath the waves. But this wasn't just any storm, and the morning of February 1st would reveal a landscape transformed into something unrecognizable. The stage was set by geography itself, and by humanity's ancient hubris in the face of the sea. Across the low-lying coasts of the Netherlands, Belgium, and eastern England, millions of people lived their lives below sea level, protected only by centuries-old sea defenses that had never been tested by nature's full fury. At the time of the flood, 20% of the Netherlands was 1 meter below sea level, with such land relying heavily on sea defenses that had been built incrementally over generations. These ancient dikes and seawalls represented humanity's gradual conquest of the sea, each addition a small victory against the eternal enemy that surrounded them. The Dutch had been reclaiming land from the sea for over 1,000 years, creating a complex patchwork of polders, canals, and barriers that formed one of the most intricate water management systems in the world. In England, communities like Canvey Island existed in a similar state of precarious balance, their homes and businesses built on land that nature had never intended to be dry. But on this particular weekend in 1953, the North Sea had other plans. What the weather forecasters were tracking was no ordinary storm system, but a deep Atlantic depression moving with unusual speed and violence toward the most vulnerable coastlines in Europe, carrying with it the power to rewrite the map forever. The storm began its deadly dance on January 30th, gathering strength as it swept across the Atlantic with malevolent precision. By the morning of January 31st, the meteorological situation had become catastrophic. Hurricane-force winds were combining with one of the highest spring tides of the year, creating conditions that meteorologists had never seen before. The Royal Netherlands Meteorological Institute had sent out telegrams warning of dangerously high water levels, but even they couldn't comprehend the true scale of what was approaching. But here's what made this storm uniquely deadly. It was traveling at exactly the right speed to push a massive surge of water ahead of it, like a liquid bulldozer, scraping the ocean floor and piling water higher and higher. The shallow North Sea, normally a relatively benign body of water, was transformed into a weapon of mass destruction. As the wind reached speeds of over 100 miles per hour, it wasn't just moving air, it was moving millions of tons of seawater toward shores that had never seen anything like it. The storm surge would eventually reach heights of over 11 feet above normal high tide levels, but the meteorologists tracking this unprecedented event had no historical data to help them predict what would happen when this liquid mountain made landfall. At 7:45 a.m. on January 31st, despite deteriorating conditions, the ferry MV Princess Victoria departed Stranraer for her routine 45-mile crossing to Larne in Northern Ireland. 179 people were on board, including 49 crew members who had made this crossing countless times before. Captain James Ferguson knew the weather was rough, but ferries had made this crossing in bad weather before, and the pressure to maintain service was enormous. What he couldn't have known was that his ship was sailing directly into the path of one of the most violent storm surges in recorded history. It took her over 45 minutes to make it to the mouth of Loch Ryan, fighting against waves that were already reaching unprecedented heights. As she cleared the loch, she was exposed to the full northwestern gale, and the true horror of the situation became apparent. The Princess Victoria was one of the first roll-on, roll-off ferries, a revolutionary design that allowed cars to drive directly onto the ship through massive stern doors. But this innovation would become a fatal weakness when the storm doors at the stern began to fail under the relentless assault of mountainous waves that struck with the force of concrete walls. As water began pouring into the car deck, the realization hit Captain Ferguson that his ship could not survive. Meanwhile, across the southern North Sea, The storm surge was building into a liquid mountain that defied every law of nature that coastal communities thought they understood. The shallow waters of the North Sea acted like a funnel, concentrating the storm's energy and pushing the surge higher and higher as it approached the coasts of the Netherlands and eastern England. This wasn't the gradual rise of a normal high tide. This was water moving with the speed and force of an avalanche, carrying with it the accumulated power of an entire ocean. In the Dutch province of Zeeland, families were settling down for a quiet Saturday evening. Many gathered around their radios, listening to weather reports that seemed increasingly ominous, but couldn't convey the true scale of what was approaching. The sea defences that had protected them for centuries, massive earthwork barriers that represented the accumulated engineering wisdom of dozens of generations, were about to be tested by a force that exceeded their design limits by an almost unimaginable margin. In the fishing village of Oude Tunga, residents could hear the sea in the distance, but the sound was wrong. It wasn't the familiar rhythm of waves against the shore, but something deeper, more menacing, like the growl of some enormous beast preparing to strike. What happened next would prove that humanity's centuries-long battle against the sea was far from won. By midnight, the storm had reached its full fury, and the North Sea had become a cauldron of destruction. In the North Channel, the Princess Victoria was fighting for her life as the stern doors were systematically destroyed by waves that towered 30 feet above the deck. Water was pouring into the vehicle deck faster than the pumps could handle it, and the ship was listing dangerously to starboard. The captain attempted to turn back toward the Scottish coast, but it was too late. The ship was losing power, her engines flooding, and the radio operator was sending increasingly desperate distress calls into the storm. At the same time, across the Dutch coast, the first dikes began to fail in a manner that defied everything engineers thought they knew about flood defences. In Oude Tunga, residents were awakened not by the sound of breaking waves, but by the terrifying roar of their seawall disintegrating like cardboard. The surge wasn't just rising, it was moving inland at the speed of a racing car, carrying with it houses, cars, livestock, and anyone caught in its path. But the true scale of the disaster was only beginning to reveal itself as the storm surge continued its relentless advance into the heart of the Netherlands. On Canvey Island in Essex, the situation was developing with the same horrifying speed. The island, home to 13,000 residents, was connected to the mainland by only one road bridge, creating a bottleneck that would prove fatal for evacuation efforts. As the storm surge approached, residents began to notice that the tide was rising far beyond anything in living memory, and it was rising fast. Much of the island was below high tide level, protected only by seawalls that were woefully inadequate for what was approaching. The first breach occurred at Tukes Creek, where the seawall simply disappeared under the assault of the surge, creating a gap through which millions of gallons of water poured onto the island. Residents in the Newlands area found themselves cut off from the only escape route as water rose around their homes with terrifying speed. Many families found themselves trapped on upper floors, then on rooftops, then clinging to chimney pots as their entire world disappeared beneath the waves. The darkness of the night made rescue operations nearly impossible, and many of those who survived did so only because of the heroic efforts of neighbours with small boats who ventured into the floodwaters despite enormous personal risk. Here's what makes this disaster truly extraordinary, and what nobody saw coming until it was too late. This wasn't just a storm surge coinciding with high tide, it was a meteorological anomaly that broke the fundamental laws of nature that coastal communities had relied on for centuries. At 10:30 p.m. on Saturday evening, January 31st, it was scheduled to be low tide, but the water remained high. While a low tide was due around then, unusually strong winds and exceptionally low pressure meant sea levels never fell as expected. The trough of water remained at near peak levels, denying coastal defences their usual slack water respite. This forced the morning high tide to begin from an already elevated baseline, producing sea levels roughly 3 meters higher than forecast. It was building on water levels that were already catastrophically high. This explained why even experienced coastal residents who had lived through countless storms and high tides were caught completely off guard. It felt like the sea was ignoring the laws of physics that had governed tidal behavior since time immemorial. The storm had essentially suspended the natural order, creating conditions that no amount of historical experience could have prepared anyone for. There were no women or children among the Princess Victoria's survivors, a fact that suggests the evacuation procedures failed catastrophically as the ship broke apart in conditions that exceeded anything in maritime experience. The storm wasn't just breaking the rules of normal weather, it was rewriting the physics of how water and wind interact with human civilization. When dawn broke on February 1st, 1953, the scale of devastation was beyond anything that rescue workers or survivors could have imagined. The Princess Victoria had sunk with 134 fatalities, making it one of the worst peacetime maritime disasters in British history. But this was just the beginning of a casualty count that would shock the world. In the Netherlands, 1,836 people had died as dikes were breached in 150 locations, transforming one of the most densely populated landscapes in Europe into a temporary inland sea. The flooding affected an estimated 160,000 hectares of land, submerging an area roughly the size of Greater London under salt water that contaminated farmland and destroyed infrastructure that had taken generations to build. Over 24,000 homes were destroyed completely, while another 19,000 were severely damaged, leaving tens of thousands of families homeless in the middle of winter. Oude Tongere in the Netherlands suffered an even more catastrophic loss. Of its 3,100 inhabitants, 305 lost their lives, a death rate that exceeded even some of the worst military disasters of the Second World War. Entire communities had been decimated in a matter of hours. Villages that had existed for 1,000 years were now nothing but debris-filled lagoons, their churches, schools, and homes reduced to scattered wreckage, floating in contaminated water. The North Sea flood of 1953 became a turning point in humanity's relationship with the sea, triggering changes that would protect millions of people for generations to come. The immediate aftermath revealed both the worst and the best of human nature, with rescue operations involving thousands of volunteers who worked around the clock in conditions that remained dangerous for days. The stories of heroism became legendary. Lighthouse keepers who stayed at their posts, ordinary citizens who risked their lives to save neighbours, and emergency workers who worked without rest for days to search flooded buildings for survivors. But the disaster also exposed significant failures in emergency planning, weather forecasting, and evacuation procedures that cost countless lives. The Netherlands embarked on the most ambitious flood protection program in history, the Delta Works, a system of dams, sluices, locks, dikes, and storm surge barriers that would take decades to complete and cost billions of dollars. This wasn't just engineering. It was a complete reimagining of how humans could coexist with the sea when weather patterns could no longer be predicted based on historical experience. Britain established the first modern storm surge warning system with sophisticated monitoring equipment and communication networks that ensured coastal communities would never again face such a disaster without advance warning. The Princess Victoria disaster led to revolutionary changes in ferry safety, with new international regulations governing stern door design, emergency procedures, and weather routing that have prevented similar tragedies in subsequent decades. But perhaps the most important legacy was the recognition that nature still held surprises that could overwhelm even the most carefully planned defenses. Over 2,500 people lost their lives in a disaster that lasted less than 24 hours, but its impact would be felt for generations. The night that brought death to the North Sea coast also brought hard-won wisdom about the power of nature and the resilience of human civilization. Today, as we face new challenges from rising sea levels and extreme weather events, the lessons of 1953 remind us that the price of safety is eternal vigilance, constant innovation, and the humility to recognize that nature can still teach us hard lessons about the limits of human control. The North Sea flood remains one of the most significant natural disasters in European history, not just for the lives lost, but for the lives saved by the lessons learned in its aftermath.